The morning of February 19th, 1945, dawned gray and ominous over the Pacific, as if the very sky knew what horrors awaited on the volcanic island below. Lieutenant Colonel James Patterson crouched in the cramped landing craft, watching his Marines check their weapons one final time. The sound of diesel engines mixed with nervous conversation and the occasional joke meant to ease tension that could be cut with a bayonet. "Remember what they told us, boys?" Patterson shouted over the engine noise. 72 hours, and we'll be drinking warm beer on this godforsaken rock." The Marines managed weak smiles, but their eyes betrayed the truth they all knew. Jima would be no quick victory. The island loomed ahead like a sleeping monster, its black volcanic beaches stretching beneath the imposing silhouette of Mount Suribachi. For months, American bombers had pounded the 8-square-mile fortress, dropping more ordnance than they had used in the entire Pacific campaign up to that point. Intelligence reports suggested the bombardment had been devastating, that Japanese resistance would crumble quickly. They were catastrophically wrong. Corporal Tommy Richardson, barely 19 years old from a small farm in Iowa, gripped his M1 Garand rifle so tightly his knuckles had turned white. This was his first major assault, and the stories from veterans of Guadalcanal and Saipan hadn't prepared him for the eerie silence that greeted them as they approached the beach. Where was the enemy fire? Where were the defensive positions they'd been briefed about? As the landing craft ground against the coarse black sand, Patterson was the first to leap over the side. "Move, move," he bellowed, his boots sinking into the strange volcanic grit that seemed to grab at every step. The first wave of Marines struggled across the beach, weighed down by heavy packs and weapons. Fighting against sand that felt more like thick mud, the silence was unnerving. Major General Harry Schmidt had planned for massive casualties in the initial landing, but the beach seemed almost deserted. Some Marines began to whisper that maybe the bombing campaign had worked better than expected. Maybe the Japanese had finally had enough. Richardson stumbled forward, his breathing heavy from the exertion of moving through the impossible sand. The beach rose steeply from the water's edge, and every step was a battle against the shifting volcanic grit. Around him, thousands of Marines were establishing their initial positions, loading supplies, and preparing for the inland push. Then, at precisely 10:30 in the morning, the silence shattered. The first mortar round landed near the water's edge, sending a geyser of black sand and seawater into the air. Before anyone could react, the entire beach erupted in a symphony of death. Machine gun fire poured down from invisible positions, mortar rounds fell like deadly rain, and artillery shells began to pound the landing zones with mathematical precision. General Tadmachi Kurabayashi had been waiting. His 21,000 Japanese defenders had spent months constructing an underground fortress that turned the entire island into a death trap. Every cave, every tunnel, every defensive position had been carefully planned to maximize American casualties. The beaches were deliberately left lightly defended to draw the Marines into the killing fields. Richardson dove behind a small ridge of sand as bullets whined overhead. The Marine next to him, a veteran sergeant from Brooklyn, wasn't fast enough. The young Iowan had never seen death up close, had never watched the life drain from a man's eyes in seconds. The image would haunt him for the rest of his life, however. Long that might be, Patterson rallied his men, organizing them into small assault groups. The easy landing had become a nightmare in minutes. Marines who had been joking and smoking cigarettes were now screaming for medics, calling for their mothers, or lying silent in the black sand that was rapidly turning red. The battle for Iwo Jima had begun, and it would prove to be one of the bloodiest campaigns in Marine Corps history. By the end of the first day, the initial optimism had been ground to powder finer than the volcanic sand beneath their boots. Colonel Patterson's battalion had advanced barely 300 yards from the beach, and every inch had cost them dearly. The Japanese defensive strategy was unlike anything the Americans had encountered in the Pacific. War Sergeant Mike O'Brien, a tough Irish-American from Boston who had fought in 3 previous island campaigns, found himself pinned down in a shell crater with Richardson and 2 other Marines. The kid from Iowa was handling himself better than expected. But O'Brien could see the 1,000-yard stare beginning to develop in his eyes. "This ain't like the other islands," O'Brien muttered, reloading his rifle. "These bastards aren't charging us with bayonets. They're fighting smart, picking us off from holes we can't even see." The Japanese had indeed revolutionized defensive warfare in the Pacific. General Kurobayashi had studied American tactics extensively and concluded that a traditional Japanese strategy of banzai charges and defending the beaches was suicidal. Instead, he had constructed an elaborate network of tunnels, bunkers, and caves that allowed his forces to appear and disappear like ghosts. According to military historians documented in Stephen Ambrose's comprehensive analysis of Pacific warfare, the Japanese defense of Iwo Jima represented the most sophisticated fortification system ever encountered by American forces in the Pacific theater. Private First Class Danny Martinez from Los Angeles crawled into the crater, his face streaked with sweat and volcanic dust. "Sarge, we've got movement in that cave complex about 50 yards ahead. Lieutenant wants us to check it out." O'Brien spat into the black sand. "Of course he does. Richardson, you're with me. Martinez, Danny, you provide covering fire." The four Marines prepared for what they knew could be their last mission. The cave entrance appeared empty, but O'Brien knew better. He'd learned to trust his instincts over 3 years of island fighting. Something about the shadows seemed wrong, too perfect, too inviting. As they approached, he noticed the telltale signs of Japanese engineering. The entrance was positioned to provide multiple fields of fire while remaining nearly invisible from most approaches. "Fire in the hole," Richardson shouted, tossing a grenade into the darkness. The explosion echoed through what seemed to be a much larger complex than they'd expected. Instead of silence, they heard the sounds of movement deeper in the tunnels. What they couldn't know was that they were attacking just one small entrance to a massive underground fortress that connected to dozens of other positions across the island. The Japanese had spent months preparing for this exact scenario, creating a three-dimensional battlefield that stretched both above and below ground. The fighting for each cave, each bunker, each tunnel entrance became a separate war in miniature. Marines would spend hours clearing what appeared to be a single position, only to discover it was connected to a network of tunnels that allowed Japanese soldiers to reappear behind them. Captain Robert Hayes, commanding Charlie Company, had lost 30% of his men in the first 2 days without advancing more than half a mile inland. The casualties were mounting at a rate that shocked even veteran commanders who had fought through the bloodiest campaigns of the Pacific War. "We're not fighting an army," Hayes told his radio operator as they huddled in a captured Japanese position. "We're fighting the island itself. Every rock, every cave, every inch of this place wants to kill us." The psychological toll was becoming as devastating as the physical casualties. Marines who had survived multiple campaigns found themselves breaking under the constant stress of fighting an enemy they could rarely see, in terrain that seemed designed by the devil himself. Richardson, somehow still alive after 3 days of continuous combat, had stopped counting the number of times he'd nearly died. The farm boy from Iowa was learning lessons about war that no training could have prepared him for. He was learning that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the ability to function despite terror that threatened to paralyze him. As night fell on the 3rd day, the Marines had secured only a small portion of the southern end of the island. Mount Suribachi still dominated the landscape, its slopes honeycombed with defensive positions that seemed impossible to assault. The Japanese were making them pay for every yard with blood, and there were still miles of fortified terrain ahead. Of them, the meat grinder had just begun to turn. Mount Suribachi loomed over the battlefield like a malevolent god, its 550-foot peak, bristling with defensive positions that had turned the volcanic cone into an impregnable fortress. For 4 days, American forces had been grinding their way across the island's southern approaches, paying in blood for every yard of black sand and jagged rock. Lieutenant Colonel Patterson stood in what had once been a Japanese command bunker, studying aerial photographs by flashlight. The images revealed the true scope of what they faced. Suribachi wasn't just a mountain with some defensive positions. It was a completely hollowed-out fortress with multiple levels, connecting tunnels, and carefully positioned artillery pieces that could rain death on any approach. Sir Sergeant O'Brien approached, his uniform torn and blackened with cordite and volcanic dust. "The boys are asking when we're going to take that damned mountain. They can see those Jap spotters up there, calling in artillery on our positions all day long." Patterson looked up at the peak, where he knew Japanese observers were watching every American movement through high-powered telescopes. "Tell the boys we go up tomorrow morning. 3rd Battalion will take the lead, with armor support if we can get the Shermans through this terrain." The plan seemed simple enough: surround the base of Suribachi and fight their way up the slopes, clearing each defensive position methodically. But simplicity and possibility were two entirely different things when facing an enemy who had spent 8 months preparing for exactly this assault. Corporal Richardson had been assigned to the Advanced Reconnaissance Team, a duty that was both an honor and nearly a death sentence. His job was to identify Japanese positions before the main assault, which meant crawling close enough to enemy lines to see the whites of their eyes. The Iowa farm boy had developed skills he never knew he possessed, moving through the broken terrain like a ghost. "You see that cave entrance about halfway up the slope?" whispered Private Martinez, pointing through his binoculars at what appeared to be just another shadow in the volcanic rock. "I've been watching it for 20 minutes. There's definitely movement in there, and it's positioned to cover the main approach route." Richardson studied the position through his own field glasses. The Japanese had positioned their defenses with mathematical precision. Every cave entrance, every bunker, every artillery position had been sited to provide overlapping fields of fire. There would be no easy approach to the summit. Colonel Harry Liversidge, commanding the 28th Marines, who had been assigned the Suribachi assault, knew his regiment was walking into a carefully prepared killing ground. But Mount Suribachi had to be taken, as long as Japanese observers controlled the peak. They could direct accurate artillery fire on American positions across the entire southern half of the island. The assault began at dawn on February 23rd. With Marine infantry supported by Sherman tanks and flamethrower units. The flamethrowers proved particularly effective against the cave positions. But each bunker had to be approached individually, often at the cost of several Marine lives. Private First Class James Bradley, a Navy corpsman attached to Easy Company, moved from wounded Marine to wounded Marine, providing medical aid under constant fire. The young medic from Wisconsin had already saved dozens of lives during the campaign. Crawling through enemy fire to reach wounded Marines would otherwise have bled to death in the volcanic sand, according to James Bradley's later account. In Flags of Our Fathers, the assault on Mount Suribachi represented some of the most intense close-quarters combat in American military history. With individual Marines often fighting hand-to-hand in tunnels and cave systems, the Japanese defenders, led by Captain Samaji and Niue, had prepared for a siege that could last weeks. Their positions were stocked with ammunition, food, and water, and the interconnected tunnel system allowed them to reinforce threatened positions while remaining invisible to American observation. "They're not going to give up this mountain without making us pay for every foot," O'Brien told Richardson as they took cover behind a destroyed Sherman tank. The tank had been hit by a carefully concealed anti-tank gun. Its crew killed instantly when the ammunition exploded, but American persistence and superior firepower began to tell. One by one, the outer defensive positions fell to coordinated attacks by infantry, armor, and flamethrower teams. The Marines developed a brutal but effective technique: sealed the cave entrances with explosives, forcing the defenders deeper into the mountain's interior. By late afternoon, small groups of Marines had fought their way to within 50 yards of the summit. The final assault would come the next morning, and everyone knew it would be the bloodiest yet. The Japanese had saved their strongest positions for last, and they would make the Americans pay dearly for the honor of planting their flag on Suribachi's peak. As night fell, the mountain continued to spit fire and death, but the Marines had it surrounded. Tomorrow would bring either victory or catastrophe. The pre-dawn darkness of February 23rd was broken by the whistle of incoming mortar rounds, as if the Japanese defenders of Mount Suribachi were making one final effort to prevent what they knew was inevitable. Lieutenant Colonel Patterson had positioned his men for the final assault on the summit, knowing that this day would either end in triumph or disaster, Sergeant? O'Brien led a patrol of 12 Marines up the treacherous northern slope of the volcanic mountain. The route had been chosen because it offered the most cover, but every step was still a gamble with death. Japanese snipers remained hidden in caves and crevices throughout the mountain's face, when one misplaced footstep could trigger carefully positioned booby traps. "Keep your intervals," O'Brien whispered to his men as they climbed through the broken volcanic rock. "These bastards are still up here somewhere, and they're not going to let us walk to the top." Among O'Brien's patrol was Corporal Richardson, who had somehow survived 2 weeks of the most intensive combat any of them had ever experienced. The young Iowan had developed the 1,000-yard stare common to combat veterans, but his hands remained steady and his aim true. War had transformed the farm boy into something harder, more deadly, though at a cost he was only beginning to understand. Private First Class Ira Hayes, a Pima Indian from Arizona, moved with the natural stealth of his ancestors scouting ahead of the main group. Hayes had distinguished himself throughout the campaign with his ability to locate enemy positions before they could spring their ambushes. His presence on the patrol was both reassuring and ominous. The brass only sent their best men on missions. They expected to be particularly deadly. The climb took 3 hours, with the Marines fighting 2 separate firefights against Japanese positions that had remained hidden throughout the previous day's bombardment. Each contact was brief but vicious, settled at close range with grenades, rifle fire, and bayonets. The Japanese defenders fought with the desperation of men who knew they were making their final stand. At approximately 10:30 in the morning, O'Brien's patrol reached a point just below the summit where they could see the crater rim. The peak appeared deserted, but they had learned not to trust appearances on Iwo Jima. Too many Marines had died believing a position was clear, only to discover it was another carefully prepared trap. "Martinez, Richardson, you two circle around. To the right, Hayes, Williams, take the left approach. I'll go straight up the middle with Johnson and Bradley." O'Brien organized his men for the final push. "If this is a trap, at least some of us will survive to warn the others." But as they cautiously approached the crater rim, an eerie silence had settled over Mount Suribachi. The constant sound of gunfire that had characterized the past 2 weeks had faded to occasional distant shots from other parts of the island. It was possible that the Japanese had finally been pushed beyond their breaking point, or it was possible they were preparing one final devastating ambush. Lieutenant Harold Schreier arrived with a second patrol and a small American flag he'd been carrying since the landing. The young officer from Pennsylvania had volunteered for the mission specifically because he wanted to be part of the moment when the American flag was raised over Japanese territory. It was a symbolic gesture, but symbols mattered in war as much as bullets. The summit was theirs. After 10 days of the bloodiest fighting in Marine Corps history, American forces controlled Mount Suribachi. But there was no time for celebration. Japanese forces still controlled most of the island. An intelligence report suggested the worst fighting lay ahead. At approximately 10:20 that morning, Schreier and 5 Marines raised a small American flag over the highest point on Mount Suribachi. The flag was visible from positions across the island, and Marines throughout the battlefield stopped their fighting momentarily to cheer. For a few precious minutes, it felt like victory was possible. But Colonel Johnson, commanding the 2nd Battalion, decided the flag was too small to be seen clearly from the beach where American reinforcements were still landing. He ordered a larger flag brought up from an LST landing ship, along with a photographer to document the historic moment. Associated Press photographer Joe Rosenthal had been documenting the campaign since the initial landing. His photographs had already captured some of the most dramatic moments of the Pacific War, but he sensed that something special was about to happen on Mount Suribachi's summit. At 1:20 in the afternoon, 6 Marines raised the larger flag. Corporal Harlan Block from Texas, Private First Class Ira Hayes from Arizona, Private First Class Franklin Sousley from Kentucky, Sergeant Michael Strank from Pennsylvania, Corporal Harold Schultz from Michigan, and Hospital Corpsman 2nd Class John Bradley from Wisconsin. Rosenthal captured the moment in what would become the most famous photograph in American Military history: the flag raising provided a desperately needed morale boost for American forces, but it marked only the end of the first phase of the battle. The northern two-thirds of Iwo Jima remained in Japanese hands, and General Kuribayashi's main defensive positions had not yet been seriously tested. The real battle for Iwo Jima was just beginning. With Mount Suribachi secured, American forces turned their attention to the northern two-thirds of Iwo Jima, where General Kuribayashi had concentrated the majority of his defenses. What they discovered was a maze of fortified positions that made Suribachi look like a training exercise. The Japanese commander had spent months preparing a defense in depth that would extract maximum casualties from every American advance. Major General Harry Schmidt, commanding the 5th Amphibious Corps, studied intelligence reports that painted an increasingly grim picture of what lay ahead. Aerial reconnaissance revealed a landscape transformed into an intricate fortress, with every hill, every ravine, every piece of high ground converted into mutually supporting defensive positions. Gentleman Schmidt addressed his regimental commanders in a captured Japanese bunker that served as the temporary command post. "We're looking at potentially the most sophisticated defensive system our forces have encountered in this war. The Japanese have had 8 months to prepare, and they've used every day of it." The terrain itself seemed designed to favor the defenders. Unlike the relatively open beaches, where American armor and artillery could be brought to bear effectively, the northern part of the island was a broken landscape of ridges, ravines, caves, and rocky outcroppings that channeled attacking forces into carefully prepared killing zones. Colonel Patterson's battalion had been assigned to assault a complex of fortified positions that intelligence had designated Hill 2622. The name was bureaucratic and sterile, giving no indication of the horror that awaited. The hill was honeycombed with caves and tunnels, each position carefully sited to provide overlapping fields of fire that would turn any approach into a death trap. Sergeant O'Brien, now leading what remained of his original squad, briefed his men on the assault plan. Cheetahs, Martinez, and 3 replacements who had arrived just days earlier listened with the grim attention of men who knew they were about to walk into hell. "The brass thinks we can take this position in 2 days," O'Brien told them, his voice carrying the skepticism of a man who had learned not to trust optimistic intelligence estimates. "I figure it'll take a week if we're lucky, 2 weeks if we're not, and some of us aren't going to see the end of it." The replacement Marines were fresh from training camps in California, their equipment still new and their faces unmarked by the particular kind of exhaustion that came from sustained combat. They would learn quickly, or they would die quickly. There were no other options on Iwo Jima. Private Tommy Chen, a Chinese-American from San Francisco, had joined Richardson's fire team just 3 days earlier. The young Marine was eager to prove himself, but his eagerness worried the veterans who knew that overconfidence killed more Marines than Japanese bullets. According to Robert Leckey's detailed account in Strongmen Armed, the assault on the northern fortifications represented a new form of warfare, where individual battles for single hills often lasted weeks and cost hundreds of casualties. The attack on Hill 262 began before dawn on March 1st, with a preparatory bombardment that lasted 2 hours. American artillery, naval gunfire, and close air support pounded the suspected defensive positions with thousands of rounds of high explosive. When the barrage lifted, the hill appeared to have been reduced to rubble, but as Patterson's Marines advanced up the slopes, the rubble came alive with machine gun fire, mortar rounds, and rifle shots from invisible positions. The Japanese had constructed their defenses to survive the heaviest bombardment, and emerged to cut down the advancing infantry. Take cover, Richardson shouted, as his squad came under fire from at least 3 different directions. The replacements, including Chen, dove for whatever concealment they could find in the broken volcanic rock. But concealment and cover were 2 different things. Japanese fire was both accurate and deadly. The advance that was supposed to reach the summit in hours stalled within the first 100 yards. Every cave had to be cleared individually, every bunker reduced by direct assault, every tunnel system explored and destroyed. It was warfare reduced to its most primitive and brutal form, small groups of men with rifles, grenades and flamethrowers fighting other small groups of men in terrain that seemed designed by a malevolent god. Private Chen lasted 6 hours. A Japanese sniper, hidden in a cave that had been cleared twice already, put a bullet through his head as he tried to advance on a machine gun position. Richardson watched the young Marine die and felt something inside himself break a little more. There had been too many deaths, too many faces that would haunt him for the rest of his life. By the end of the first week of March, American forces had advanced less than a quarter mile into the northern defensive zone. Casualties were staggering. Some companies had been reduced to fewer than 30 men, and replacement Marines were being thrown into combat within hours of arriving on the island. The Japanese strategy was working exactly as planned. Every yard of advance cost the Americans dearly, and there were still weeks of fighting ahead by mid-March. The battle for Iwo Jima had devolved into a series of individual struggles for features on the map that held no strategic value beyond the fact that Japanese soldiers were defending them. Hill 362, Turkey Knob, the amphitheater, Charlie Dog Ridge, names that would be remembered only by the Marines who fought and died to take them. Lieutenant Colonel Patterson had been evacuated 3 days earlier after a mortar fragment tore through his shoulder, leaving Captain Hayes in command of what remained of the battalion. Hayes was a good officer, but he was fighting a war of attrition that no amount of tactical skill could overcome. The Japanese were determined to extract maximum casualties from every position, and they were succeeding. Sergeant O'Brien now commanded a company that existed more on paper than in reality. Of the original 180 Marines who had landed, with the unit, fewer than 40 remained effective for combat. The replacements arrived constantly, but they died almost as quickly as they could be integrated into the existing units. Richardson had been promoted to sergeant after his predecessor was killed by a cave-in during an assault on a tunnel complex. The Iowa farm boy was now responsible for 12 Marines, most of whom were younger than he was, despite the fact that he was still only 20 years old. War had aged him decades in a matter of weeks. Sergeant Intelligence thinks there's a major tunnel entrance behind that ridge, reported Corporal Davis, one of the few original members of the squad still alive. Davis was a tough kid from Detroit who had survived by developing an almost supernatural ability to sense danger before it became lethal. Richardson studied the terrain through his binoculars. The ridge looked innocent enough, but he had learned to distrust innocuous terrain features on Iwo Jima. The Japanese had become masters at concealing their positions, turning the island's natural features into elaborate camouflage for their defensive works. "We'll go in at dawn," Richardson decided. "Full squad, with flamethrower support and a demolition team. Want this done right the first time." He had watched too many Marines die because of hasty, poorly planned assaults on Japanese positions. The attack was supposed to be routine by Iwo Jima standards, which meant it would probably only cost them 2 or 3 casualties instead of half the squad. But as they approached the suspected tunnel entrance, Richardson realized they had stumbled into something much larger than intelligence had predicted. The ridge concealed the entrance to a major Japanese command complex, complete with living quarters, ammunition storage, and a sophisticated communication system that connected to defensive positions across the northern part of the island. Taking it would require days of underground fighting in tunnels that branched in multiple directions. Private Martinez, now one of the senior men in the squad despite having arrived as a replacement, LD the first probe into the tunnel system. What he found was an underground city that had been carved from the volcanic rock with typical Japanese efficiency and attention to detail. As documented in Richard Wheeler's Iwo, the Japanese tunnel systems on the northern part of the island represented some of the most sophisticated military engineering of World War II, with multiple levels, ventilation systems, and carefully planned escape routes. "Jesus Christ," Martinez whispered as he returned from his reconnaissance. "Sarge, this thing goes on forever. There's got to be 100 Japs down there, maybe more." "No, and they've got supplies stockpiled for weeks." The assault on the tunnel complex took 11 days. Marines would advance through the underground passages during the day, clearing rooms and smaller tunnels with grenades and flamethrowers, only to discover that the Japanese had reoccupied positions behind them during the night. Using passages that hadn't been discovered yet, it was warfare at its most claustrophobic and terrifying. Marines fought in complete darkness, guided only by muzzle flashes and the screams of dying men. The air was thick with cordite smoke, dust, and the smell of burned flesh. Men went insane from the stress and had to be evacuated, their minds broken. By fighting an enemy they could rarely see in tunnels that seemed to go on forever, Richardson lost 4 men in the tunnel fighting, including Davis, who was killed by a booby trap that brought down a section of tunnel roof. The young sergeant from Iowa found himself wondering how many more friends he could watch die before his own mind snapped. But gradually, methodically, the Marines cleared the complex. Room by room, tunnel by tunnel, they eliminated the Japanese defenders or sealed them into sections that could be bypassed. It was brutal work that required a level of courage that went beyond anything taught in training. When the tunnel complex was finally secured, they discovered maps and documents that revealed the full extent of Japanese defensive preparations. General Kiribayashi had planned for a battle that could last months. Supply depots, hospitals, command centers hidden throughout the island's underground network. The battle was far from over. But American forces had broken the back of one major defensive position. There were dozens more ahead of them, each one prepared with the same fanatical attention to detail that had made the tunnel complex such a deadly trap as March drew to a close. Both sides were exhausted, but only the Americans could replace their losses. The Japanese were fighting with the desperate courage of men who knew they were doomed but were determined to make their deaths count for something. By the last week of March 1945, American forces controlled nearly 90% of Iwo Jima. But the remaining Japanese defenders had concentrated in the island's most rugged terrain for a final stand that promised to be as bloody as anything that had come before. General Kiribayashi had established his final command post in a cave system near the northern tip of the island, where his remaining 300 men prepared to die fighting. The Japanese commander knew the battle was lost, but he was determined to exact maximum casualties from his enemies before the end came. His final messages to Tokyo spoke not of victory, but of honor, of making the Americans pay so dearly for Iwo Jima that they would think twice about invading the Japanese home islands. Sergeant Richardson, now commanding the remnants of 3 different companies that had been consolidated due to casualties, led his men toward what intelligence believed was Kiribayashi's final position. The 20-year-old from Iowa had survived 5 weeks of the most intensive combat in Marine Corps history, watching most of his friends die while somehow remaining alive himself. "How many you figure are left up there?" asked Corporal Sanchez, a replacement from New Mexico who had arrived just 10 days earlier but had already proven himself in the tunnel fighting. The young Marine had the quick reflexes and steady nerves that kept men alive in close combat. Richardson studied the rocky terrain ahead through his binoculars. The landscape looked like something from another planet, a maze of volcanic rock formations, collapsed caves and shell craters that provided perfect concealment for defenders. "Enough to make us work for it," he replied grimly. Major Williams, the battalion commander who had replaced the wounded Hayes, gathered his company commanders for a final briefing. The major was a veteran of 3 island campaigns, but even he seemed subdued by the casualty reports from the past 5 weeks. "Gentlemen, intelligence estimates we're facing the last organized resistance on the island. General Kiribayashi is believed to be in overall command, and we should expect these people to fight with particular determination. This is their final stand." The assault began at dawn on March 26th, with a preparatory bombardment that seemed almost routine after weeks of similar attacks. American artillery and naval gunfire pounded the suspected Japanese positions, raising clouds of dust and smoke that obscured the battlefield for hours. But when the Marines advanced, they encountered the same deadly accurate fire that had characterized Japanese resistance throughout the campaign. Kiribayashi's men had used the final weeks to prepare positions that were nearly impregnable, the overlapping fields of fire that turned every approach into a killing ground. Private Johnson, one of Richardson's squad leaders, was killed in the first 5 minutes when a Japanese sniper put a bullet through his head from a concealed position that had survived the bombardment. The young Marine from Alabama died instantly, adding his name to the growing list of casualties from Richardson's original unit. The fighting continued for 6 days, with American forces gradually reducing the Japanese defensive perimeter through a series of coordinated attacks that combined infantry, armor, and flamethrower units. Each cave had to be cleared individually, each bunker reduced by direct assault. Each tunnel system explored and destroyed. General Kurabashi made his final radio transmission to Tokyo on March 23. The battle is entering its final phase. My officers and men have fought gallantly. I'm sorry we could not defend the island better. I will fight to the end for the honor of the Empire. On the night of March 26th, Kurabashi led his surviving men in a final banzai charge that was more gesture than military operation. The Japanese commander and his remaining soldiers attacked American positions with swords, bayonets, and the few weapons they had left, seeking death with honor rather than capture. The final Japanese attack was brief and futile. American firepower cut down the charging defenders within minutes. Ending organized Japanese resistance on Iwo Jima, General Kurabayashi's body was never definitively identified, although several Japanese officers found among the dead matched his. General description: at 600 hours on March 26, 1945, Major General Harry Schmidt declared Iwo Jima secure. The battle had lasted 36 days and had cost the Americans nearly 7,000 dead and 19,000 wounded. Japanese casualties were estimated at over 18,000 killed, with fewer than 300 prisoners taken. Richardson stood among the rocky terrain where the final battle had been fought, looking out over an island that had been transformed into a moonscape of craters, destroyed vegetation, and scattered equipment. Of the original 42 men in his unit who had landed on February 19th, only 7 remained alive and unwounded. The victory had come at a price that shocked even veteran commanders who had fought through the bloodiest campaigns of the Pacific War. Iwo Jima had proven that Japanese defenders, given adequate time to prepare and sufficient determination to die fighting, could extract casualties from American forces far beyond anything previously experienced. But the island was secure, its airfields available for American use in future operations against Japan. The black volcanic sand that had absorbed so much American and Japanese blood would now serve as a staging area for the final assault on the Japanese home islands. If that proved necessary, as Richardson and his surviving Marines prepared for evacuation from the island, none of them could have known that their sacrifice at Iwo Jima would help convince American planners that an invasion of Japan would cost casualties beyond acceptable limits. The battle that had seemed like such a strategic necessity would ultimately contribute to the decision to use atomic weapons to end the war. The flag still flew from Mount Suribachi, but the cost of planting it there would be remembered long after. The strategic importance of the island had been forgotten. Iwo Jima had proven that victory in the Pacific would require a price in blood that America was only beginning to understand.